Thank you for giving me the time in court to speak today. Firstly, I want to address the fact that, unlike in the trial, I am now a litigant in person. I decided to self-represent for this sentencing, not because I want to be challenging, but because I don't want to have someone with my best interests at heart. I don't want this hearing to be a way to get the best personal outcome. It is for me to speak more for the community. I have, and always have been, community-minded. Your Honour may argue that this conviction of an offence says otherwise, but I think it is a pro-social conviction. My involvement with this action has always been about protection. Protection of the action takers in terms of their access to information, risks and emotional well-being, and protection of the wider community in trying to mitigate the worst of climate collapse. My role in this action was to ensure people were prepared emotionally for the risk of prison, as well as funneling action takers into appropriate teams and picking up tasks that people asked me to do, as I was able to be on the ground in London. Without knowing the details of the action, I put my trust in others who I knew would design non-violent, proportional actions to highlight the climate crisis and demand change. There was, of course, a risk that these actions could be disruptive, but equally as possible that they weren't. I knew public nuisance was a possible charge for this action, alongside all the other actions that were happening. But given I have previously been arrested for public nuisance for wearing a JSO t-shirt, I don't immediately associate it with disruption. I personally don't like disruption. I struggle with it as a concept and often live my life in a way that causes the least disruption. I do, however, think sometimes it is necessary. Not only necessary, but one's civic duty to stand up against what is wrong. And sometimes this is only the option left to us. For example, I support unions' industrial action. Much like with civil resistance, this is not a decision that is taken lightly. I supported the Criminal Bar Association strikes a few years ago. Yes, 6,000 court hearings were disrupted. Some might argue that's a public nuisance, but this ultimately resulted in positive change for the community. And, of course, the courts have acknowledged the importance of protest in the past. To quote Lord Hoffman and Jones, quote, "My lords, civil disobedience on conscientious grounds has a long and honourable history in this country. People who break the law to affirm their belief in the injustice of a law or government action are sometimes vindicated by history. The suffragettes are an example which comes to mind. It is the mark of a civilised community that it can accommodate protests and demonstrations of this kind." In regard to my sentencing, I will make brief submissions. The Crown have helpfully drawn your attention to two notable sentencing judgments, but omitted other statutory public nuisance substantive sentences from the Hallam 25 appeal, who were given sentences ranging from 20 to 24 months for the actions that caused exceptional level of disruption. However, it's important to note, as per Hallam 2025 in paragraph 7, quote, "References to the sentencing outcomes in different cases are unlikely to be helpful, since each case will turn on its own facts. It can be dangerous. An approach that treats a 3-year term for offending similar to that in Trowland as a benchmark risks undesirable and unwarranted sentence inflation." So, perhaps it is also important to consider the sentencing of protests at Crown Courts where the facts were more similar to our case. Protests at airports are nothing new. For example, when 13 people cut a hole in Heathrow perimeter fence, locked on airside and caused 6 hours of delay, they received a 6-week suspended sentence and community service, albeit having only been charged with aggravated trespass. Or a sentencing which took place in this Crown Court last year before Judge Edmonds, where a group of people used drones to try and shut down Heathrow Airport and received suspended sentences. Although that was under common law public nuisance, the facts were more serious. Their prosecution's case was that the plan was to shut down Heathrow over multiple days. Another important consideration, as the Crown have kindly already submitted at paragraph 31, is that it was found in Hallam that conscientious motivation is a factor relevant to sentencing. As we were unable to describe our motivations in trial, I want to briefly outline my motivations now, so Your Honour can appropriately consider this when assessing our culpability. I have first-hand experience of the climate crisis. Just one example of this is, while living in Australia during Black Summer, fires tore through neighbourhoods and property and livelihoods were destroyed. There are still people living in caravans 4 years on. This is an example of how we can't rely on our governments to help protect us in times of crisis or beyond. Significantly for me, 2 of my friends, both of whom are blind, got an alert telling them that fires were approaching and they needed to immediately evacuate. However, being blind, they can't drive, and their children and their carer were too far away at the time to make it back. So they had to sit there, wait, and hope they didn't burn in their own house. This is but a glimpse into what is coming down the road for more and more people around the world, and something I am not happy to sit idly by and accept. I was working as a support worker at this time and knew my client, who has severe autism and mobility issues, would completely freeze if a fire alarm were to go off, and the thought of him, too, burning alive because of the intersectional issues of climate collapse and disability is too much for me. In the wake of the Black Summer, Rupert Murdoch, who sits on the board of Genie Oil and Gas, used his media empire to spread misinformation about the cause of the fires, so much so that his son, James Murdoch, left News Corp, citing climate disinformation as his reason to do so. I accept that this is not new to you. You yourself, Your Honour, have said in a previous trial that the average person would consider the climate crisis far more serious than a public nuisance. I genuinely believe that any non-violent, peaceful protest based on science and research are not only conscientiously motivated, but also pro-social acts. I deny that I have breached community norms in the involvement of this campaign, but have instead acted on behalf of the community. The prosecution's case in the trial was based on the harm that may come to people who were disrupted. This is not something I want to discredit or diminish. As I've already said, preventing suffering is a primary driver for me, and thus I do not want to cause it. There is a philosophical term named antinomy, which refers to the idea of a moral pull in opposite directions. Here, the desire not to disrupt people, contrasting with the need to take practical and effective action to prevent mass suffering and mass loss of life. It does seem that the prosecution's case, specifically the references by Captain Bland to the heat and discomfort people might be in if trapped in an aircraft, is an ironic parallel of what will happen to a countless section of the public as the climate crisis takes over. And this, after all, is what we are trying to prevent. Furthermore, the juxtaposition of the Crown being able to talk about the potential and hypothetical emotional distress those who might have been disrupted might feel, yet jurors being told to leave their emotions at the door when it comes to the climate crisis and motivations, and being denied the evidence of the extreme harm already occurring, highlights the political coercion and ideological biases we are witnessing within these courts. The corruption of the legal system doesn't stop there. We are frequently seeing new laws being brought in to quash protest, which have been advanced by lobbyists and fossil fuel industry funded think tanks such as the Policy Exchange. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and the Public Order Act are two recent examples of this. But how are new legal defences brought in? I have heard throughout a plethora of recent trials that, unfortunately, it's not a defence to cause disruption in the aim of preventing climate change. But maybe it should be. We have seen countless laws or prosecuting of the past that we look back on in shame. There will inevitably be a time, perhaps when we are living through the worst of climate collapse, where people are struggling to grow food and people are starving, or our children are having to take up arms to defend resources, that society will look back on the court's treatment of protesters simply trying to protect others with remorse and shame. We see the inconsistencies in the courtrooms, with some trial groups getting acquitted, often when the trial judge allows legal defences, to some being punished with unruly sentences. How can we think that the legal system is just when so much hangs on the decision of one person? The Crown have drawn your attention to the offences I was on bail for at the time of this offence. I don't disagree with these and understand the argument that these are aggravating factors. However, it is of significance that two of these have since been NFA'd, one is RUI'd, and I've been found not guilty at trial at Stratford Magistrates of the other. Thus, there is only one actively outstanding. Whilst I admit that some actions I have engaged in, most of these arrests were objectively unfair and feels like a ploy to arrest us simply to have us on bail and thus be used as an aggravating factor in the future. I want to highlight some corrections to the prosecution's sentencing note. Firstly, I want to clarify that I was not paid for my position in JSO from March 2024 onwards. Secondly, at 13H, it is important to note that no one was paid for taking part in this action, and I am unsure where that allegation has come from. Finally, at 15E, the alleged reputational damage to Heathrow Airport and consequently the UK. I would argue that because multiple airports across multiple countries were used as sites for action across the summer, and no airport or country has had their reputation damaged for this, the only damage to the UK's reputation has been the fact that, despite this being an international action period, it was only action takers in England who were sent to prison. To conclude on why I don't believe people should be sent to prison for trying to protect life, I want to communicate my fears of the consequences of this continued crackdown on protest. At the moment, non-violent civil resistance is successfully being championed as a way to peacefully bring about change. However, with people facing multiple year sentences for engaging with this kind of action, I fear that people will turn to other methods. Methods which I don't necessarily condone. For example, is it not noteworthy that assault occasioning actual bodily harm has a maximum sentence of half the length of what we are facing with our charge? Furthermore, as we are already seeing happen, people will start becoming unaccountable or going underground. This is the consequence of state repression and high sentences, and this will inevitably lead to more dangerous or violent actions. As Nelson Mandela said after his group's actions reluctantly turned violent, quote, "It was only when all else had failed, when all channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us, that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle. I can only say that I felt morally obliged to do what I did." The fate of the future of protest rests on the state's shoulders, and that includes your honours. On to my personal mitigation. I'm not going to pretend that prison is a nice place and that it won't have ill effects on me. It will mean I can never return to my fiancé abroad, as a sentence of 12 months excludes me from the country permanently. It will have poor effects on my physical health. I will likely have countless more episodes where I can't access my essential medication and consequently will have to lie on my cell for days, unable to move once again. The student that I teach maths to will have to go longer without access to education, having already had to wait almost a year to continue her studies. But this doesn't mean I'm scared of it. And as Hoffman identified in Jones, protesters who behave with a sense of proportion must vouch the sincerity of their beliefs by accepting the penalties imposed by the law. And I am okay with this. But I don't accept that a custodial sentence as a deterrent will work for myself. In fact, I believe that it may be the most radicalising thing that the courts can impose on me. The prison system and those incarcerated highlight the failings of our society to support and rehabilitate people. So many women do not have a voice in prison, are completely dehumanised, and significantly act as case studies into the failings of both society and our justice system. Sending me back to prison will continue to open my eyes to the systemic issues women face and will drive me to do all within my power to make change for the greater good. We have recently passed a significant time. In February 2021, Sir David King said we have 3 to 4 years left to determine the future of humanity. We have now passed this deadline. I don't know what this means for the future of the climate movement, or for me in terms of civil resistance. I do know that my personal priorities right now are to mitigate the consequences of climate collapse on my community. As aforementioned, one part of the community with absolutely no voice, not even the power to vote, are prisoners. They are also treated with the least respect. Remember in Hurricane Katrina, where prisons weren't evacuated and people died? This is something I foresee happening down the road to my friends at Bronzefield. My friends in Australia, in the Lismore floods of 2021, underwent this, climbing the floors in their house to escape the rising waters. Some people were unable to get high enough and drowned in their attic, clawing at the roofs. I've already suffered seeing people lose everything, including their lives, from inaction of the state, and I am not ready to sit idly by and see it happen again. I want to be able to make change for my fellow prisoners, and perhaps the most practical place to do this is in prison. If freedom means existing in a country which continues to fund climate collapse, which continues to ignore the safety of its citizens, which continues to crack down on people trying to encourage positive change, then I don't want your freedom. And it is for that reason, despite disagreeing with the crackdown on protest and deeply thinking our actions should not be criminalised, I invite you to give me a custodial sentence for as great as your conscience allows.